Hi, everybody. Welcome to Listen Up with Mike. I'm Mike, and I'll be your guide through this journey of growth and learning. In this episode, I'm going to have a conversation with my friend, Hope Anderson, and we're going to talk about learning, teaching, resources for learning and teaching, and her experience with her company, which is Teaching Solved. So stay tuned and let's start with our conversation. So today I'm with Hope Anderson. We met on Facebook. We are part of a group. These kind of groups on Facebook are for people who are interested in learning Spanish. The one in which we met. She's fluent in Spanish, and she's also the founder. And please, you will correct me if I'm wrong in this. She's the founder and CEO of Teaching Solved. Teaching Solved is a company which is focused on providing teachers and students with learning and educational resources, right? So thank you, Hope, for accepting my invitation. Welcome to the podcast. And can you please share a bit about yourself, your journey? How did you become fluent in Spanish?
Good question that I get a lot. Actually, the funny thing is usually when I tell people that I teach Spanish, they say, "Oh, so do you speak Spanish then?" I'm not sure why they would think I don't, but no, it's an interesting story because I actually started studying Spanish when I was about 14 years old. Because I thought it would be the most useful here in the US. Now, I'd already been traveling. I had the opportunity to travel a couple of times to Asia with my parents when I was a child. And so I already knew I had a love for travel and languages in other countries. I just didn't know exactly what one to focus on because I knew people from other countries and who spoke other languages. And really, I had studied the most Chinese up to that point, but I didn't know a lot of people in my community who spoke languages other than Spanish. There were some, but really the community language besides English was starting to be Spanish where I was growing up in Indiana. And so I really wanted to learn Spanish, thinking it would be the most useful in the US. Never thought I would be teaching it someday. It was funny because I always had intentions to teach music.
Oh, so you're a
I
musician
went to
too.
yeah,
Ah,
so
that's cool.
I actually did a music major in my undergrad. I did piano, voice, and composition,
Wow.
and it was funny because I love doing Spanish, and so I did a double major. And then when it was time to start applying to graduate schools, which I wanted to do because I knew I was going to have more education before teaching on the on the college level or trying to figure out other opportunities. I didn't have teaching certification as part of my college degree, so I wanted to go on and at least get a master's, probably a PhD. And I realized I wanted to go on with Spanish and linguistics instead of music, which I still love music. I still actually have one piano student, but at this point, I really am focused on starting the company, on teaching Spanish and linguistics, and really trying to make a difference in the field of language learning because I have struggled my whole career in teaching since 2006 with availability of materials, with knowing about better practices and being able to implement them. And I wanted other teachers to not have to, I mean, we all have to go through our own journey, but not have to struggle to figure it out as much on their own. And that is what I was lucky enough to have a couple of good mentors along the way who provided me with materials. Even if I decided down the road that I didn't want to use theirs and wanted to use mine, at least I didn't have the feeling of being stuck after having spent hours creating them all, which I think a lot of people feel, and so they're more hesitant to change if it's working. Don't break what's working already. And then I had other mentors who helped me see when I went back to graduate school to get my PhD. I had other mentors who helped me see that your textbook is not your curriculum, that there are ways that you should figure out what the students need to know and then choose materials to support that rather than just teaching the book. And I think that more than anything
It's like
was something that,
customizing the teaching experience.
right, exactly. And that more than anything, I think was what helped me figure out, okay, well, what do I need to support my students in what I think they need to know based on what's in our syllabus, et cetera, that's not in the book. And then since I wasn't finding it, I had to make it. And so that in a nutshell is eventually what led me to Teaching Solved.
Oh yeah, I was going to tell you that would be like the birth of Teaching Solved, as your
Mm-hmm.
as your personal project, right? Before we get into that, you made me think about something. You mentioned China, right? So you speak Chinese as well.
Not anymore. It's funny because I actually met a teacher at a conference recently when I was at the Texas Foreign Language Association who was showing me little videos of her bilingual students in her dual immersion program speaking Mandarin, and she wanted me to record one. I said something to her in Mandarin, and she wanted me to record one for them, so I did.
Okay.
It was
Do
very
you
funny,
remember what
but
was that?
you know what?
Do you remember what was?
Well, I think it was that she said xie xie because I gave her a tote
She
bag,
says thank
and
you,
when she came up
right?
to my booth, yeah, and so she said xie xie, and I said bukachi, and she just turned back and looked
It's
and
like,
thought about it,
whoa.
and then she asked me about it, and so I told her, well, I studied Chinese before I went to China with my parents, but I was
Oh.
11, and that was 1993, and
Yeah, it's a
or
completely
1994.
different thing.
Yeah,
It's a different
yeah,
approach.
and exactly. And so it was more like literally I did cassette tapes for like 6 months, like when I was, 10, 11. And, it wasn't something that I had really kept up because I think well, this leads me to another issue about that I really want to tackle in Teaching Solved, which is I didn't have the connection to be able to keep the language up once I had done my study, done my 3 weeks abroad. I came back. I didn't have, especially with a language that doesn't have the Latin alphabet, I didn't have any really good way of accessing media at that time. Nowadays, of course, we have the internet. I didn't have the internet. It was 1994, right? And so I was never really as good at the writing system because obviously it was harder if you're coming from English to learn all the Chinese characters.
Yep.
And so I was
You
able
you
to
need to you need a
say.
base of like 2,000 kanji characters for
Right.
starters.
I was able to say more than I was able to read. And so what's the easiest way to keep it up on your own when you are back in your home and you don't have a lot of people around is reading, right?
Yep.
And I couldn't read.
Yep.
So that was, I think, part of my problem. And so one thing that I haven't really addressed yet in Teaching Solve, but it was sort of my other idea when I first came up with the whole ecosystem for the company and how I could help, was how to help students keep up their language after they finish their language study or come back from the place, because sometimes the attrition is more of a problem than the learning in the first place. However, the two really do go hand in hand. The better your proficiency is when you finish your study, the less you're going to forget, or even if you do forget it, the more easily it will come back if you're back in that situation. So I really decided to focus more first on the learning than the remembering later. But it's really it's really two sides of the same coin. So what I really want to do in the future is through my lessons, because I link to authentic and comprehensible materials in the materials that I create for teachers. So I've created search engine, I create the lessons, Spanish, French, and English. And then what I do is I link to the materials. Because that way I don't have to create a whole bunch of inauthentic things myself. I can link to the things that are out there that other teachers have made or
Already
that
designed for
are
that.
authentic.
That are already designed for that. You don't have to go
Right,
through
exactly.
yeah.
Or they're authentic. And so like if you're trying to teach your grammar but also your vocabulary and you put both into Google, you get explanations, right? If you put both into my site, you actually get pages that are written in that language using that grammar. And so it's easier to kind of get that connection to real world things. Well, what I want to do, and I try to do this to some degree with my students, but it's hard in like a one semester class. Sometimes it's easier if it's a more consistent process throughout their whole language study, is introducing them right to music, movies, topics online. If they're interested in skateboarding
Subjects of
culture, they
interest
can learn about
for
they can
the
learn about
person who's learning.
Right, if they're interested in skateboarding culture, they can learn about skateboarding culture in the target language speaking countries, right? If they're interested in a certain type of music, they might say, oh, wait, I thought all music in Spanish was reggaeton because that's all I'd heard, and then they find out that, that there's all these other genres, right? Not to disparage any one genre or interest, but they don't realize how much is out there. And so when they get exposed to that, then they say, oh, wait, I can listen to the same type of music or watch the same type of movies, but in Spanish, in the language. And so then hopefully that's an interest that will help them if you give them the skills to unpack real world media, which obviously they can't do in a first semester class without, any scaffolding. But if you give them snippets, if you build up to things where they can understand it, then hopefully it can introduce them to something that they can carry with them. And then they can, start following accounts on whatever their favorite social media platform is. I teach college, so, I don't have to worry as much about the age restrictions on some of these things. Not that I use it really in class that much, but it's more just, I don't make them post things on social media. It's just if they want to start following accounts, like if they get interested in a band or, a certain type of, or an actor or something, right? They can start following those accounts on social media, and then they can start reading posts, right? Watching videos. They get more exposure to the language about something that interests them, which to me is what it's all about. Why are we learning the language if we don't have that connection to the people, to the culture, to the food? I always joked about how, it's a good thing I like food from all over the Spanish-speaking world because, I really should have picked my language based on what food I liked the best.
Well, and it's interesting now that you mentioned before your experience. Once again, I'm coming back to where you mentioned something about living in China, and even though maybe I'm wrong, even though I as far as I understand, in the United States, Spanish and Chinese are two major minorities, right? But when you got back to the States, was it hard for you to find people who were like from Chinese heritage, or people from China who could be like your language exchange partners and you could interact with them, so not just with Spanish?
I was 11 and I was homeschooled. So it was, my
Ah,
circle was a little bit small, right? But also, I was in Indiana. I mean, it was not nearly, even though I was in Indianapolis, so it was a big city, and there was starting to be more of a Spanish
okay,
speaking community there
all right.
in the 90s. It really, the Chinese populations, right, in the US were mostly in California, mostly in other major cities that were not Indianapolis. So it was definitely, I mean, and now that I teach languages in the US at Arizona State, I'm teaching my students about all these different immigrant groups and all these different languages in the US, and the ones that originated here, the native languages and the immigrant languages, and how these groups arrived here and how they maintained or lost their language, and what do we know now about language maintenance and heritage language education, and how we can build all of that in, and what do the studies say. And honestly, there was this one day I had half the class reading, well, they could choose, but some of them read an article about maintenance of Korean in Los Angeles and maintenance of Spanish in Nebraska. And it was much easier for the families to pass Korean on to their children and have access to that language education in Los Angeles than Spanish in Nebraska.
Yeah,
And so, it really depends on where you are, what language, where you are, whether that's an important thing for you, for your family to be able to maintain that. That's a home language, but in the case of a second language, it's even worse because your language never got to that point. You don't have your family around all the time to speak it with. And so it was definitely something that maybe my mom and I could have tried a little better to keep up Chinese, because she had studied in graduate school as well. But it was not something that, we built into our daily lives. And so,
yeah, and actually Spanish is a major
yeah.
minority right now in the United
Uh-huh.
States. So everywhere you're gonna find people speaking Spanish and with needs of communicating either in Spanish or in English that they can. Now, the whole thing that you talked about is basically what led you to start with teaching Solve,
Mhm.
right? What makes it unique compared to other language learning or teaching resources?
Yeah. So when I created Teaching Solved, I wanted to have I wanted to fill in the gaps of what I wanted as a teacher, and I wanted to really do two things. I wanted to make it more efficient for teachers to prepare effective lessons, but then I wanted those lessons to be more effective for the students. And I mean, there's plenty of ways you could teach a language in an effective way, but there's even more ways you could teach it in an ineffective way. And by that, I mean opening up a book as a student or as a teacher and saying, I'm just going to go through this in order. It doesn't work, right? I was just having this conversation yesterday with a friend who had, been trying to learn languages on her own, and in addition to the, places that she had lived, she was trying to, take classes, go work with tutors. Had been doing a variety of languages on her own, and she said, if she had known then what she knows now about language learning, she would have done things more efficiently, right? And this is exactly the thing that I'm trying to help teachers with, because it took me so long on my own to figure out about teaching, about what I needed to create for my students, what I needed to look for, how to find those things Googling, because it's not necessarily obvious how to find a page written in the grammar form instead of containing an explanation of the grammar form. So that's what I created. It's a platform that's for teachers. So the platform is called Lesson Magic. I may be renaming that because people tend to get it confused with Magic School, but the platform is called Lesson Magic. And it's found at teachingsolve.com. And what the basic platform is free, and it is a search engine that helps teachers, well, students can use it too, but it's really designed more for teachers, to find resources that correspond to the vocabulary, grammar, and culture topics that are in their unit. But it's not, there's some like explanatory videos and things that come up, but it's really not designed to just be like, learn about this, take a test, and now you're done. Okay. And now you forget it and you move on, which is what I think too often happens, especially in college level classes, when we have to be like, okay, we have 4 days on this unit, we have 4 grammar topics to cover plus vocabulary. Oh yeah, we have to fit culture in at the end, right? It becomes inorganic, inauthentic. And so what I want to do is really have your materials help you support proficiency goals, proficiency gains. So we usually say, right, in our courses, all the state standards are based on what you can do at each level in all 50 US states. The ACTFL proficiency standards, can-do statements, are based on what you are able to do. And it's not about certain grammar forms. It's about, being able to talk about your daily activities, or it's about being able to make plans with a friend for the weekend, or it's about being able to understand the main point and some details of a story you read or something like that. And it's very, very, very specific for the different levels. But then the question becomes, what level are you expected to be able to do at what grade level? And that is not usually specified, because it depends when you started. It depends did you have Spanish an hour a week or 5 hours a week, right? Also, how different is that language from your native language? If it's Spanish, you're probably going to at least know the alphabet when you start, right? It's pronounced differently, but you can at least see a word, recognize it. Oh yeah, that's similar to the English word, right? If I say grupo, you're going to know that's group. And so there's a lot of words that are either borrowings or cognate words because of the same Latin origin, where, it's easier to get that proficiency early on in some languages, whereas Chinese, Japanese, if there's a borrowing, right, there might be a borrowing. If there's a similarity, it might be by accident, right? There's a lot. It's just the writing system is not transparent for English speakers. So there's a lot of hurdles to get through. So we can't just say, oh, by the end of year 1, year 2, you should be here, because it depends on so many factors. And so what ends up happening, right, is that the commonality, the things that the schools can say, oh, you have to cover at this level, becomes the vocabulary, grammar, culture that's in the selected textbook, rather than everybody by the end of freshman year should be able to order in a restaurant, right? And so the hard thing is trying to take that system and adjust it so that the teachers have an ability to find and use materials that support those proficiency goals at the same time that they're covering the topics that are in their book. One of the best pieces of advice I was given about language learning, or really language teaching, was through the California World Language Project. And if you are a language teacher and you live in California and you are watching this, I highly recommend you look them up, because they have like 5 or 6 different sites around the state where they invite teachers to come for free to their workshops for a year. And this is where I learned
that's on site or online?
It's on site. I don't know. I moved away from California in 2011, so I don't know if they have any online option nowadays. But I do know that traditionally their model was they had like 5 different sites all over the state, and they had some. We would experience the activities. So there would be a theme, and we would experience the activities. It would be all day Saturday. We would experience the activities in the language in the morning, and then we would kind of interact with the other teachers doing the activities, and then we would have lunch, and then they would put us in groups like by language, and we would plan something using what we learned for our class the following week. And that was a fantastic model, because we got to experience what a language class was supposed to be like, right, in all these different ways, shapes, and forms. And I loved when they would do the lesson in the language and not just in English, because sometimes they would do it in English so everyone can understand, which I get if it was a little harder lesson. But when they did the basic ones in Japanese or in French or whatever, I understood so much and learned so much about the language, about teaching, about, oh, this is what it's like for my students. And so I got so many great activities from there. And The reason I mentioned that is because I moved to Arizona and I was like, okay, now I need to look up the Arizona World Language Project. And of course, there isn't one. It's literally just a California thing. It's not like there's one in every state. But one of the best pieces of advice that I got at the World Language Project was, well, actually, I don't know. I can't really even narrow it down. But one was about how, we're always racing to cover material, cover, and we have to uncover it, right? We have to help the students discover it. And I really feel like that changed my perspective on teaching, because I'm like, oh, what activities can I do to help them go, oh yeah, it clicks, I get it, right? All of a sudden I understand the subjunctive, ha, 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 right? But it's like, no, you're uncovering it. There's a lot of work, there's a lot of prep, because the students aren't just reading an explanation or hearing it and suddenly internalizing it. You
Now,
can use things in, yeah, sorry.
I'm sorry. It's because
Yeah.
you're telling so much things, and I have so many questions.
Oh, yeah.
But
Sure.
there's a lot of interesting stuff you're mentioning.
Yeah.
And I'm not gonna ask you all of the questions, but at least a couple ones.
Yeah.
Education versus acquisition, right? So when you get into the classroom and you are going to teach, let's say, people who's learning from scratch, do you go, let's say, they're Spanish speakers who want to learn English. You go in Spanish, or you go in English from the very beginning?
So this is hard because the only time that I've taught English as a second language, I did not have a shared first language with the students. So I had to go in English from day one,
Oh, okay.
even though they, there were things that might have been easier if I could have switched to Chinese to do it, but they were mostly, it was at Indiana University. They were already living in the US, right? It wasn't quite like true beginners. They were in college level classes. So they obviously had a level that was higher. But there were people teaching in that same situation who were teaching true beginners from all over the world, who had just come to the US for the intensive English program.
They didn't have a clue, and they didn't know even a word.
Right,
English.
exactly. And so they basically had to do it in English from the beginning. They basically had this picture dictionary, not in my class because I was teaching academic listening,
But that was because
true
of the
beginners.
limitation, not because of it was intended to be like that.
Right, the true beginners had the picture dictionary, and so they would have the picture and the English word. And I remember visiting one of these classes and thinking, I wish we had this in Spanish. Like when we taught Spanish to true beginners, I wish we had this picture dictionary, which is not like the kids like word book. It literally was for adults, and it was like each thematic topic had the pictures and it had the words in English. And I was like, why don't we have this in Spanish? Because then we could be doing more in Spanish from the beginning. And the problem is often what we have to teach, back to the covering and uncovering, because I feel like if we didn't have to cover the grammar in such a way that we feel like we have to explain it, that's when you switch to their native language. Usually is you're explaining the grammar. But if you are able to just do the activities using a small piece of that grammar and keep it in the language, then
that would be the acquisition part of the.
Then it starts sounding right. Exactly.
Okay.
By the time then they ask you, well, wait, why is it sad and not estar? And then you explain, right? But I feel like you have to have that language first, because just putting in rules, it's not the Matrix. You can't just put in a file and say, oh, I know Kung Fu, right? It's like you have to actually have those experiences. I wish
it was like that.
But you have to have those experiences where you're using the language. And Stephen Krashen has defined this as the difference between acquisition and learning, right? Acquisition is what you're just doing in the language. You are acquiring it naturally. Learning is you're learning things about it that allow you in the moment. If you start saying, I goed, and then you go, wait a minute, no, I learned the role for that. I went, there, right? It's that self-correction, that monitor. But the thing is that it was never really intended to be a method where comprehensible input as a method where, oh, you just give them input all the time, they just listen, and eventually they know the language. Yes, we know that helps, that works, but we also have to use some of the adult or adolescent, if you're teaching middle school, high school, cognitive faculties that the students have to shortcut some of that. Because like I tell my students when they're like, oh, I sound like a toddler when I'm speaking the language, you say, how long did it take you to learn to speak your native language like a 10-year-old? 10 years,
10
right?
years, yep.
So it's going
and they're going, we could say they're going 24/7.
Right,
that
exactly.
Was total immersion. And
so then you say, well, you don't have 10 years and your brain is more developed than it was as a toddler, so we can take some shortcuts. For me, that's the hardest thing, is knowing what they need. And of course, every student in the class is going to be different, knowing what they need to just do in the language simplified so that they get some language and they start getting some confidence and they can start doing it and understanding more. And then where we need to take those shortcuts and say, okay, well, now that you know that verb, there's 5 others that work like that, go home and study them, right? And that's the hard thing, is knowing how much of it to do as shortcuts as that sort of education or learning, right? And how much to do as acquisition.
So in this case, let's say, you go to regular school here in Colombia, and they have this program. So they say, the first you're going to learn is this, then you're going to learn that, blah, blah, blah. Like, and it's the same for everyone. So that would be like, that wouldn't be the most optimized way for learning then. It would have to be more customized to whomever is learning the language, you think?
Well, it really depends, because it depends how much they're getting, right? Because the thing is, a lot of times people have this kind of memory, which may be faulty, of, well, this is what I did and it worked for me, and therefore that's what I need to do for my students. But the reason I say memory is faulty is because, 1, it is, and 2, sometimes what we remember working for us is because some variable was different. So either we had more time during the day that we were using it inside and outside of class, or we cared about it more because we grew up to be people who use language professionally. And so we cared about it more, whereas the students are oftentimes just taking it for a requirement, and they're going to stop using it the moment they walk out of class. They're not going to go onto Spotify or whatever and put on their playlist in the target language, look up all the words that they don't know, like I did, right? When I was learning. Well, I didn't have Spotify in those days. It was CDs in my car. But basically I was like, when I was in college, I remember I would go to Borders, I would literally buy CDs of music in Spanish, and I would have them in my car with the little lyrics books, right? And in the case, and I remember as soon as I got there and parked my car, I'd be opening up the lyrics books and looking up all the things that I was trying to figure out what they were saying. And so it was, it's hard because there's so many variables that we say, well, we learned this way, why isn't it working for them? Well, they're not spending the time, or their interests are different, or really, usually the biggest thing is by the time we remember, well, someone corrected all my errors and it helped. By the time that we remember them doing that and it working, we had a much higher level of language. We weren't true beginners. We were already living there, or we were already using it professionally. I still remember the time that I had just started. I don't think I had even just started teaching. I think I'd been teaching for a year or two. And I remember trying to say something about, well, I've already printed that, to my colleague. And I said, he imprimido. And she corrected me, he impreso, right? Impreso. And I was horrified that I had made the grammar mistake in front of my colleague. So I immediately went to Word Reference, looked it up. And it was funny because Word Reference actually said that the verb to print, imprimir, both were accepted as a verb. But as an adjective, if you open a book and it says impreso in Mexico, printed in Mexico, it's going to say impreso. And so, in her variety, fine, whatever. She said impreso, and she maybe wanted me to know that if it was an adjective, it needed to be impreso. But technically, the way I had said it wasn't wrong. But I remember that. But think about it. I was already teaching by that point. So, I had been studying the language, using the language, maybe 10 years by that point. So that's when we remember, if you corrected a first semester student on something, right, they won't necessarily have that uptake of that feedback, right? They might not necessarily turn that into something that helps their developing language system. And so it's very hard because we sometimes try to model the practices that we think work best for us, and it breaks down and we don't know why, because it could be any one of these reasons. And so this is why I'm trying to help teachers. So I mentioned the search, right, with Lesson Magic, but then the other piece of it is the pre-made lessons that I've created. And that's the freemium part, right? That's the part where they can, if they take the resources and they want to use them on their own, great. But then if they don't really know how to put the lesson together without reverting back to this sort of explanation first type of methodology, I have these example lessons that they can use as is, or edit, or use as a model for their own, which I've taken the resources that I want to use that relate to their topics, and I've matched up the vocabulary, the grammar, the culture, some combination that's often put together in a typical book. And then it basically just goes through in order where it's not explaining all the grammar first. It's giving them enough prep activities on the vocabulary for being able to understand the readings or the videos, to be able to do the activities with each other, to turn to each other and talk. It has a lot of pictures describing the words. And then, because we don't have the picture dictionary, and then going from there, it goes into the reading or the video, which hopefully they're able to understand more by that point because of all the preparatory activities. But it's also focusing on the grammar in the sense of like pulling out those forms and using those new forms from the unit as the words that we're prepping with before they watch the video or do the reading. And so it's kind of doing double duty so that you don't have to have the whole explanation with the full chart, but you are familiarizing yourself with these forms. So for example, for stem changing verbs, I've viewed some videos from YouTube on the rules of football, soccer, and baseball in Spanish for children. And so it's this animated guy kicking a ball and like explaining about soccer. And it's kind of hard for a second language learner. And so what I've done is I've taken some of the terms that are going to be used in the video. I've made these preparatory activities by scraping through the transcript, pulling up, and I focused on the stem changing verbs. So the words that you're using to help you understand the video are also the words that are going to be in your grammar lesson. And so it works like that, so that by the time you get to the end and you're asking each other questions, you're not going to say, well, why isn't it that? Because it just doesn't sound right anymore. And so that's really the crossover between acquisition and learning for me is, it doesn't have to just be isolated one or the other. It's more like, oh, well, it's starting to sound right to me because of these forms that I've been using this whole lesson. And now by the end, when I have to go online and do homework to, practice the rule or whatever, it's like, oh, that's why. And so, I can't change the field entirely. I can't get them away from this whole grammar first methodology, but I also don't want people to think that I don't approve of teaching the grammar at all. It's just that trying to correct them on every single thing before they have enough language to make it meaningful is not going to help. And I really, in the minimal
people
time,
are going to get frustrated in the process.
Right. In the minimal time that the students have with exposure to the language, every week, I really want it to be maximized for effectiveness. And that's why I've created Lesson Magic. So,
in fact, you made me. You reminded me of something that happened recently. I have a friend who's he lives in the United States. He was born there, and he lives there. I met him there, and he's a speech pathologist. I have a granddaughter, and we talk. She's in the United States, and we talk on a daily basis. And so from time to time, I make videos, and I share the videos with my friend. And she's 8 years old, and when we talk, there was a video in which she was saying, "Oh yeah, that's more better," and I said, "No, baby, it's not more better. You say much better." My friend saw the video and says, "Miguel, don't make corrections. Don't do that." And I was like, "Why?" And he said, "You're being a teacher. Don't do that. Instead of that, say the thing the right way, and she's gonna get it. Don't make the correction because that's not gonna help at all."
Right. And it's hard because as a second language learner, right, you don't have 8 years to learn to speak like an 8-year-old on the one hand. On the other hand, like knowing when those corrections are going to be helpful it's hard, right? And so, usually some of that can be up to the learner because, sometimes rather than correcting every single thing in a writing assignment, you can focus on one type of error, one pattern of error, or one thing that you want them to something you want them to be able to use more productively, maybe even more so than an error, like showing them a pattern and saying, well, then you can use it to say this and this and this, right? And have it not just be so error focused. And then if the student wants but why was, was this okay? Like I remember going up to my teachers and asking them about other things that maybe they didn't mark and saying, was this okay? Could I say it that way? And they're like, well, it would be better to do this, right?
Okay.
But then I try to teach people not to make corrections on every single thing because it's frustrating to the student, and then when it goes right in the trash after class,
it's not gonna
exactly.
Stick. Yeah.
Then the teacher feels like they wasted their time.
Yeah.
And it's hard because when I was training TAs, I remember telling one of them when she was complaining about how long grading took and asking me for help with speeding that up. I said, just make a decision that you're not going to spend more than 5 minutes per paper. And I remember her response because it struck me as something that I didn't have a response to, which was, the two of you, right? It was me and a colleague helping her with the strategies. She said, the two of you, it may be because you're more experienced, it may only take you 5 minutes per paper, but it takes me 15.
Oh, 3 times.
And I remember thinking that. I'm like, well, set it, and I think he said set a timer and stop after 5, regardless of whether you've gotten to the end. But, I was just sitting there like, because it's, teaching is a skill, grading is a skill that comes with practice, like the language learning for the students. And it's hard because, the teachers see themselves as, needing to be the be all end all of knowledge for the students, and see it as a deficiency if they don't spend that extra 10 minutes grading. And and then it adds up over a class of 30, over 2 classes of 30, right? And it's hard because you want to do your best for your students, but you're going to burn out. And so being able to be more efficient, and nowadays, of course, there's things that the students can do on their own. I mean, I tell them, have the students, again, college, so I don't have to worry as much about age limits for platforms, but have the students put their own writing. We actually built it into one of our writing assignments. I said, you have to turn in a screenshot of Spanish Checker, that you put your writing through Spanish Checker. 5 points for showing the screenshot that you put it through Spanish Checker. 10 points if the version that you turn in actually shows that you've made some corrections based on what you got from Spanish Checker. That's before your instructor even grades it. So you're able to find some of these things that will slow them down, that will maybe make them spend time correcting things that are not, if you do it yourself, then it's already going to be better, and you can focus on the meaningful things by the time it gets to your instructor. That, I think, helped a ton, because the thing is, it's hard to do with ChatGPT, because ChatGPT, I was just talking about this in the presentation that I gave at ACTFL the other day in Philadelphia, that with the AI, the tools are not necessarily set up for having students learn to do it themselves. If you put something in ChatGPT and you say, make it 10 words shorter to help me fit under the word limit for my abstract, or, correct my mistakes, it will rewrite the whole thing. It won't necessarily tell you, like I intentionally put in a sentence one time with a mistake in ser and estar, the 2 verbs for to be in Spanish. And I said, find my mistake, explain why my mistake is wrong. And it sort of did, but it rewrote the whole sentence in just to use a different verb like colocar or something. Like it gave me a different sentence instead of just correcting it, which I thought was so interesting, because it's a language model. It's based on all of this information that's been fed into it. It's not really processing it based on the rules that we teach the students. And then I'm like, well, wait a minute, if ChatGPT was able to learn language just from a huge amount of input, and it doesn't really know why something is wrong, it can't count how many R's are in the word strawberry. That's one that's been going around online too. It insists there's only 2 R's in strawberry. And it doesn't know these things about language, but then it's able to produce something that sounds amazing. And, not that our students are machines, but we can learn a lot from that about what is worthwhile and what is not, right? Based on how ChatGPT learned language. But as far as the tools, right? There's nothing that beats something like Spanish Checker for actually finding the mistakes and correcting them, because ChatGPT can't do that.
Yep.
And there's other tools that are for speaking, for helping you find the mistakes in whether your word sounds more like another word or not. There's tools for that now where people can go online, record themselves, and it basically does you can even do it with your phone, the dictation, but there's actual tools where you can create activities to do it. Like iSprock.net. And the thing is that they use, they can use these tools and they can see, okay, well, that's why, they're not understanding me, because it's parsing it as a different word. That's the kind of meaningful distinction to me that makes more sense than just your tongue is not in exactly the right position when you say R. That's something they need to learn, but not every single time, because then they're going to get frustrated. And so, helping teachers make those decisions for what's more efficient, what the student can do on their own. I do a lot of trainings, some relating to my product, some relating to just teaching methodologies in general, whatever the needs are of their place, to help teachers with some of these things so they don't burn out, so that the students get more out of their classes. Because what gets harder and harder is you're teaching Spanish 2, Spanish 3, Spanish 4, French 2, French 3, French 4, and they don't know Spanish 1 or French 1. Like, they might have taken the test, they might have gotten A's, but if they're not developing those proficiency, those functional skills at that level, then you're up there trying to explain, well, now we're going to talk about our day in the past, and they can't do it in the present. And so they have nothing to hang it on. And so it's really hard when they're trying to take these more advanced classes that, maybe get ready for a seal of biliteracy or an AP, and their experience with the earlier classes was really just, these discrete points. They might know some cultural information, they may know about certain kinds of verbs, but as far as actually being able to parse what they're hearing, it gets harder and harder and harder to do it in the language as the level goes up of the class and the student's level does not.
What's been the most rewarding experience that you've had with teaching solved?
Oh, the most rewarding experience I've had teaching solved. I love when people like come up to me in conferences and recognize me and say they're using it and it's helping them. Like to me, that is the major thing. Like it's saving them time, or they're able to find things that they, like one TA told me that she had saved what is usually like 2 hours finding an audio passage for an exam. She found it in about 5 minutes using my platform, which
great.
I mean, that to me is like, yeah,
Rewarding,
I want the results from the students, honestly. I want a student to express that they have learned more because their teacher was using my platform. But right now, because it's still pretty new, I haven't had those kind of longitudinal experiences yet to be able to measure. Right now, it's more just the feedback from the teachers where, they look at it and they say, wow, this is going to save me so much time, or even better yet, it has saved me so much time. And that to me is the most rewarding at this point.
And talking about misconceptions when learning or teaching languages, what are some common misconceptions that you have found? Let's say like people who say, oh, I want to be fluent in 6 months, which is kind of crazy.
Right. Yeah, well, one, go there. But two, I think that there's two different kind of extreme misconceptions, and the truth is kind of somewhere in between. Sometimes people say, well, you have to go there to learn it. You can't learn it without going there. And so, anything we do in our classes is just going to be kind of rudimentary, And so yes, that's true in a broader sense, the culture, the experiences, but we also shouldn't write off the time that we have, right? Yes, the main purpose of the classes really should be to excite them about getting involved with the language, the culture outside of class, right? The internet, travel, so hopefully study abroad someday, making friends from that culture who speak that language, right? So maybe that should be the main goal more so than specific language skills, but really, to me, we shouldn't write off what the time that we have for actually developing those functional language skills. But then there's the other misconception, which is that it's the grammar that's holding people back, when usually it's the vocabulary. Usually it's, and again, it depends what's grammar and what's vocabulary. It depends how your language works, right? If your language has a lot of prefixes and suffixes and you don't recognize a word that you even know because of the grammatical forms, okay, right? I'm looking at things like Estonian and Finnish where all the different endings, wow. And there's things that, it really depends on your language. But for the most part, I would say it really is vocabulary, where if you're not understanding the majority of the words in the sentence, or even people have done studies with like comprehensible input demonstrating that even 10% unknown words can completely change the meaning of the sentence. So, but that doesn't mean you're not learning anything. If you understand 90%, it's still probably pretty good. But, people argue over how much you have to understand in order to get the meaning, to get something out of it, to learn. But really, it's the vocabulary, right? Regardless of the specific percentage, it's the vocabulary that's holding people back. And so the more we can give students enough uses, and I don't mean decontextualized, repeat after me repetitions, I mean actual, usages in a reading, a video, a class activity, turning to each other and talk. But then the biggest misconception that I've encountered is I don't want them to hear it wrong. I don't want them to learn it wrong. So oftentimes they don't let them turn to each other and talk because they don't want them to pick up bad habits from each other. And people worry about habits. They worry about fossilization. Habits are associated with audiolingual method, behaviorism, which is outdated at this point. It was kind of like rats in a maze, right? Like we were being treated like laboratory animals in our language classes, where they were designing them back in the day, where if this is the stimulus, then the response is a certain thing. And in your native language, right, you might be, hi, how are you? Great. How about you? It's kind of automatic, right? And so they were trying to automatize these stimulus response patterns. And so they'd be like, hola, ¿cómo estás? Muy bien. ¿Y tú? Oh, excelente, gracias. And then, chao, hasta luego. They would automatize these responses. But then the problem is people would be repeating these dialogues and they wouldn't know what they were saying, or they wouldn't know what to say when the other person got off script, because in the real world, people don't follow the dialogues.
I've been there with Japanese. I met the other guy, well, it was like 2 years ago. I met this Japanese guy here at a restaurant, and I was like, hajimashite, what does she want me to do this? Yoroshiku onegaishimasu. And the guy started speaking from Japanese, and I was like, wait. That's the only thing that I know in Japanese. I basically don't know more than a few words.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's because you're a language person and you have that one phrase really, really
It's like,
good,
yeah,
right? When I was doing the California World Language Project, it was funny whenever we'd be doing an activity in Japanese, the Japanese teacher would be like, your Japanese accent is so good. And I'd be like, okay, that's scary. It's because I would just pronounce it like Spanish. And like 95% of it would be correct because I was pronouncing it like Spanish, right? And it's like that's kind of scary because then you get this like flood of Japanese back at you.
Yeah, and it's funny because when you read the Romaji for Japanese, and if you read that like if you were reading Spanish words, you sound perfect in Japanese.
Exactly.
It sounds like the perfect accent.
It's really just the R that's different, and it's funny because and so and on the one hand that's a good thing, right? Because then people are willing to engage with you more and give you language, but on the other hand they're like, what, you don't understand me, right? Yeah. So it's funny, and so to me those are kind of the biggest misconceptions about like what to do with the time we have available to us, what the main goal is of the classes. Is it just to get them to want to learn more? Is it to give them cultural understanding? I mean, people always try to defend the existence of their language program by saying, well, we're the only department on campus that gives them that intercultural understanding. Well, other people have caught on to that. And now the history department says, well, we give them that cultural understanding. And all the social behavioral sciences departments are all giving them that cultural understanding, right? And so now the problem is what makes us unique? If ChatGPT and Google Translate are good at producing long strings of language, it's not perfect, but if
they're getting there.
If what a student can produce after 4 years of a language is no better than what ChatGPT or Google Translate can produce, and there's other classes on campus that are giving them that cultural piece, how do we defend our right to exist as a language program, our need to continue? And so this is what I've really been digging into lately about trying to figure out how to articulate what makes us different or better in terms of what we're teaching the students to do than what Google Translate or ChatGPT can do on its own. And that requires a fundamental rethinking of our curricula, of the way that we structure our language courses, of the way we spend our time. Because even like cultural knowledge, right? Having the references, having the idioms, having the literary references, you can feed literature into ChatGPT as well. And it's hard to kind of draw that line between and I'm using ChatGPT kind of as a catch-all term for all of these AI models, but it's hard because we know that it's important to be able to have that language skill and not just go up to someone in a country and hold up your Google Translate. But on the other hand, I mean, there were a lot of people who worked with, for example, Ukrainian refugees or other refugees who had no language in common, and they have been successful in interacting with refugees using Google
Thanks
Translate
to the tools,
as an app.
Right.
And so it's like, there's definitely reasons why we need to continue, but if we don't articulate them and structure our curriculum around them so that we can demonstrate how we are different and better and how these language courses have a need to continue existing, then it is scary what's happening with these tools. And if we focus solely on the grammar and after 4 years the students cannot produce it as well as Google Translate and ChatGPT, we are focusing on the wrong thing. And so building in that cultural knowledge, building in those opportunities to speak the language, to use it in a real world setting, whether it's with an exchange with people online, whether it's using authentic materials, whether it's engaging in a conversation that's happening globally on important topics, but in our own classroom, taking that other subject knowledge that they have and being able to bring it into the classroom is amazing and gives them the opportunity to want to continue it outside of class, with kinds of art and music that they already want to engage in. But it's hard because every student's interests are so different. We have such limited time. We're up against all of these tech tools. We assign something for the students to do outside of class. I mean, that's the other thing that's really cut way back on our ability to have the students do as much outside of class is you assign something outside of class and ChatGPT writes it. And so then you have the student in class, they can't explain what they wrote. You're having to take class time to have them redo it in front of you while the rest of the class is moving on to something else, right? It's this whole thing where the easy way for a teacher or a student is oftentimes something that doesn't help build up those skills for next time. Yes. And so it gets harder and harder when you have the students in the higher level classes because through no fault of their own, they're busy. They have a tool that can do this, but it's depriving them of those skills to move forward. And so people are talking about just going back to pencil and paper for everything. And that's what I was presenting about in Philadelphia, was how to AI proof your assignments. Because if the students are not using these tech tools at all, if we're just going back to pencil and paper, we're losing our tech literacy. It's already getting worse. The joke used to be, if you wanted to know how to do something on your computer, ask a millennial, right? Now, and then it was ask Gen Z, and now it's, well, Gen A can do it if it's on a phone, but I don't know if they know how to do it on a computer consistently, right? And so it just has turned into this sort of like this tech literacy. If you Google how to paraphrase, which is a very important skill, right? You write an essay. One of my participants in the session on Sunday was telling me this. She has them paraphrase their introduction in their conclusion when they write an essay. And if you Google how to paraphrase, it gives you tools that do it for you. It does not teach you how to paraphrase.
How to do that, right.
Right. And this is something that I noticed, and I had to explicitly start teaching my students. I had to create activities on our course website where I would take some content related to the course, and I would say, okay, here's a quote from this week's reading. Let's say you want to paraphrase this quote in your paper. Which of these is the best paraphrase? And I would create questions that some of them were too close. I only changed a word or two, right? Others, I moved the order around, right? Changed a few words and changed the order of the sentence. And then some of them said a different thing entirely, right? And so the idea is figure out which paraphrase is the most distinct from the original without saying something different. And then do it yourself. And these are tools that it'll do it for you, but it doesn't teach you how to do it anymore. And, how are we going to maintain our tech literacy in every generation if we're so worried that they're just going to have a tool do it for them that we don't assign it at all, or we just have them do it only on pencil and paper in class? And now suddenly what used to be 5 hours of class per week plus homework time has now turned into maybe 2 or 3 hours of class per week, and we can't have them write anything lengthy outside of class. So I wish I had a good solution, but what really my presentation was just a series of strategies. It was more like process oriented, how to teach them to use appropriate tools. It was a collection of strategies that had come from experts in the field and my own experience. But there's no magic bullet for it. There's no perfect solution.
And a lot of times people don't want to spend time and effort trying to learn how to do that, but rather just to get the result and whatever easy way they can get it.
And also, I think a lot of times the second language, books maybe pay lip service to some of these strategies because it just kind of assumes that they have it already from their first language, but they maybe need to explicitly be told to apply it in the second language, but maybe they don't need to learn it from the ground up. They don't necessarily have these literacy strategies in their first language either. And it's going to be even harder as we get students in our more advanced classes who missed out on basic phonics and reading during the 2020-2021 year. We're already seeing effects of that, but when we get, when those students reach high school without strong literacy skills, that is going to be an even bigger problem. So, preview of coming attractions.
Hope, if you had to describe your whole journey in one Spanish word or sentence, what would it be?
Esperanza. I mean, it's my name in Spanish, right?
Yep.
And basically, I feel like my whole journey with, trying to figure out a better way or, sharing it with other people has been predicated on the fundamental assumption that a better way is out there, right? That there is something that I can find or develop or help people understand. I mean, I think the biggest realizations for me, have come these different points that I mentioned, right? Like your textbook is not your curriculum. Help the students uncover it rather than just covering it. When I figured out that, we don't just, I think one of the biggest realizations I had was I had this, back in the day, this big English-Spanish dictionary, right? And it had all of these things in the English side about how to do things in Spanish and vice versa, right? Like how to write a business letter, lists of irregular verbs. And then they had it the other way around in Spanish about English.
Oh.
And the first time I realized that there was a chart of irregular verbs in English, that some were regular, some were irregular, just like Spanish. And I've been using them my whole life without even thinking about which ones were which.
Yeah.
I was 16 years old when I realized English had regular verbs.
Oh. Well,
I thought they were all irregular. I thought you just learned them all because that's how I learned them just growing up, right? You just learn how this verb works. And then And then I think about that sometimes when I'm helping Spanish teachers. I'm like, I want them to see that you've been using this your whole life without even knowing which ones are regular, which ones are irregular, right?
Yep.
So for me, it's just like about the hope of that journey, that like knowing that like something better is out there, and we're going to have these realizations over time, these discoveries, and we want our students to have them. We want other teachers to have them. We're on this journey together, right? We want people to have this opportunity to not have to reinvent the wheel in every generation or in every class, but build upon what's out there, not just because it's easy, but because it works, and hopefully both, right? And then we can have the best experience that we can for ourselves and our students. Teaching as a profession, it's challenging to do. And we're losing teachers. I mean, in Arizona alone this year, by a couple months into the school year, 25.4% of positions statewide, teaching positions statewide in Arizona, were unfilled. They just can't fill all the positions, and because there's so much that gets in the way of what people love about teaching, and people aren't graduating from teaching programs in sufficient numbers to keep up with all the new schools that are being built. People aren't staying in the profession very long. They just can't afford it. Or the summer, they have 3 months where they're unpaid in the summer. They have to go get some other job. It's hard to get a job that pays the bills for 3 months in the summer, and then when they know you're going to leave in the fall to go back to teaching. And so, we need to have hope for the profession, because I'm worried that they're just going to reset that staffing level, right, and call that 100%, right? It was 75% filled. Now that's going to be called 100, and then go down from there. What's going to happen in a couple of years, right? And it really makes me nervous, because we're going to have to create other opportunities for students to learn languages that are not just either go there or do an app on your own, right? How are we going to build these communities? How are we going to build these intentional communities and activities where, I mean, honestly, if I wanted to learn more about cooking vocabulary or art vocabulary in a language, the way I would want to do it would be by taking a cooking class in the language, right? By taking an art class in the language. Like,
Totally,
this is
totally.
how I would develop that vocabulary. And we're going to have to start figuring out, how to take career and technical education and do it in the language, right? Rather than CTE saying, oh, no, language, that's an academic subject. We don't do that here, right? We're going to have to figure out how to start combining this and building it in, because we need to have, to think outside the box and have hope for the profession to be able to continue to provide those opportunities to the students, even as we lose teachers, even as it's harder and harder to break out of those lockstep textbook platforms where people just have to go online and do the activities. And then by the time they get to Spanish 3, Spanish 4, it's hard for them to understand it, because they've just been clicking grammar forms, because that's what the school requires. And so we're really going to have to just be creative, and rethink. And I guess maybe creatividad would be the other thing for me, for my journey, because when I ran into roadblocks in one respect before I got my PhD, I kept running into roadblocks as an adjunct instructor, where I couldn't choose my textbook. I couldn't, I didn't know everything that I wanted to. I needed to go back to grad school. So I did. I went back and got my PhD in second language acquisition and teaching at the University of Arizona. And I also took some coursework at Indiana University. And in both of those places, really, I learned so much more. I felt so guilty about some of the things I had done without knowing better, in my first 5 years of teaching. But, I moved on and I redid things. And every time I ran into a roadblock, with the system was not willing to budge, I said, okay, well, what can I do to help not only fix this system, but to help people who are stuck right in this system somewhere else? They're not able to use a textbook that they prefer. So what do? They create everything themselves. How can I keep them from creating everything themselves, if they don't want to? And so, I really, for me, it's been about hope and creativity.
Hope. If listeners could take away, both learners and teachers, one piece of advice from this whole conversation, what would you think it would be?
That's hard. Learn a language. It is worth it. If your negative feelings about language learning have come from prior experiences with trying to do it on your own, stop using the apps, stop using the books, use it with people, and then figure out, read a children's book together with a friend who's also trying to learn the language and or who speaks the language, and try to figure it out together. Use the visuals, use YouTube, not just explanations about the grammar, but actual stories that are in the language, things that are designed for children. Be a child. Do things that in the language, right? If you can take an art class or a cooking class in the language, do it. I mean, I feel like all of these experiences are things that get a friend to, help you narrate your day as you do it in the language. I mean, I think these are all things that will make the language come to life. And if you don't have this fear of just learning it wrong, or having to start from the basics, or having to learn every possible thing before you can open your mouth, then I think it's going to help you in the long run. I would say just do it. And as a language teacher, I would say be a student again. Pick a different language and learn it, or at least engage in some beginning basic activities. And I'm not saying, even if you go to a class and go to the first couple of days and hate it, that you learn something. Don't become what you hate, right?
Yeah,
I've
sure.
done that, and I've gone, this is what I don't like.
I wouldn't
But
like
then
to.
also, or just pick a language and start watching things in it. I mean, I feel like this is something that sometimes we lose sight of as a teacher, because we remember, the things that we think worked for us, but we had a higher level by then. The things that you do as a low-level learner, you can see easily if they help or not. So those are my pieces of advice.
Hope, where can people find you? More about you and about Teaching
Yeah,
Solved.
they can find me at Teaching Solved on most of the platforms. At YouTube, it's at Teaching Solved. You have to put the @ sign. And on the other platforms, it's Teaching Solved. And yeah, that's
And the website.
me. And yeah, teachingsolved.com.
Yeah. Hope, thank you very much for accepting this invitation. I hope this is not going to be the last one. I think there's still a lot more to talk about. And thank you very much once again.
Thank you so much for this invitation. I really appreciate it.
So that was it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully you're going to learn and get some stuff that can be useful in your own learning or teaching process. So looking forward to seeing you in a future episode. And remember, you can find the full transcription for this video on my website, www.miguelpenilla.com. So stay focused, stay tuned, and keep on learning. Bye-bye.